No problem. Bonjour, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to just join this fantastic group. Again, my name is Ian Williamson, and I currently serve as the Dean of the Paul Merage School of Business here at the University of California, Irvine, California. I am originally from the United States, born and raised in Chicago, so that is my home, but have had a pretty extensive career globally, and it is just a pleasure to be able to join and speak with you today. The topic that I'm going to speak to you about is developing a resilient talent pipeline, a resilient and inclusive talent pipeline. And I'll express some of the things that I see as being important for business schools to be doing. I've experienced this and seen this across many communities. And so I just want to share this as an opportunity to appreciate the importance of business schools and communities and how they can make such a major impact, if they so choose, in the well-being of the communities that surround them. But before we jump into that, Yink has asked if I can maybe give a little bit of a background of myself, and I'll go ahead and do that. As I mentioned, I'm originally from the United States, and I was trained in the United States, have my PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I am a management professor, so I'm a little bit out of my league here with my finance and accounting colleagues. I hope you'll tolerate having a management person in your presence. You can imagine I won't have a lot of numbers in my slides. But I started my academic career at the University of Maryland, where I was an assistant professor there, teaching in the MBA programs that they offered, so based in Washington, D.C. And after doing that for many years, my family and I decided to relocate, and we moved to Australia, where I was at the Melbourne Business School at the University of Melbourne. Again, serving as multiple roles. I led our executive MBA program. I founded a social impact center that had the goal of understanding how businesses and business schools can play a role in addressing intractable social issues. And I'll talk a little about that later on and how influential that experience was in shaping my perspectives on the academy and ultimately shaping some of the decisions I've made as I've taken on senior leadership roles at universities. It's a phenomenal experience. I also was the associate dean for international relations for the business school, which meant I did quite a bit of extensive work across Southeast Asia, developing partnerships and developing programs that we ran for that school. After over 10 years at the Melbourne Business School, I left and had the great opportunity to join Victoria University of Wellington in Wellington, New Zealand. This is where my paths crossed with Yinke, where we were very fortunate to have him join our faculty. And there I was the Dean of the Wellington School of Business and Government, as well as the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the university. And it was a fantastic opportunity to work with that institution and the fantastic community there to help, again, establish the role of the business school as a driver of economic and social change. And most recently, about a year ago, I relocated to California, where I am now serving as a dean here at the Paul Merage School. Very different type of school, Southern California, Orange County, primarily known for, from its industry perspective, we have a huge technology space here, quite a bit of firms in the fintech area, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, med tech, very large. In addition, of course, we also have Disneyland. So many people would know about it just because of that. So these are some of my academic experiences. Along the way, I've had and still maintain several appointments at different institutions around the world. I've done quite a lot of work in Indonesia over the years. And in fact, my family and I lived there for a period of time, where I was based at Institute Technology Bandung, working with their entrepreneurship program, but have worked in Poland, Switzerland, and quite a bit of work across Asia as well. Now, my expertise is in how organizations develop and retain effective talent pipelines. And this is a very practical issue for many organizations. And as it allowed me to work quite extensively with a wide variety of organizations around the world. And this is just a sense of some of the organizations that I've had a chance to work with, a wide variety of sectors and a wide variety of industries. I probably work now in over 25 different countries. Very pleased that I've had some opportunities on multiple occasions to do work in South Africa, was extraordinarily rewarding experience for me. And it really, I think, has given me a chance to understand some of the drivers and some of the challenges that businesses face in a wide variety of locations, and how history, culture, geographical region, demographics, all those things play a role in shaping outcomes in organizations. And I think this will be a starting point for my talk, because what is common across all of these scenarios, and when I was working with these companies, oftentimes with the leadership team, the senior leadership team or the board of directors, is that they were interested in speaking with me because they were dealing with major challenges that had happened in their environment that threatened their business model in some way, shape, or form. And the question they oftentimes were raising with me was, how do we develop not just a strategy to respond, but how do we execute on that strategy? And specifically, what are some of the talent needs that we will have to have as an organization to be successful? Now, as an academic, this was a very exciting and interesting question for me. And in essence, what we're trying to understand in these situations was how the firms and organizations, and in some cases government agencies, would best respond to disruptions. Now, I have a definition I use for that. And for me, disruptions are shifts in the external environment that have the potential to render existing organizational strategies ineffective or irrelevant going forward. And what's key in this definition is it's external, so things that are happening that are beyond the control of an organization, and that it's taking something that the organization currently does, and perhaps does well, perhaps does better than anyone else, and rendering it ineffective or irrelevant going forward. And one example of this might be, I was doing some work with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, clearly a very influential, very successful organization, highly competent, highly skilled. And we were really thinking very clearly around how things like fintech were taking some of the things that they were probably best in class at and making them irrelevant and ineffective, and what was going to be their response and what implications that it has. Now, there's a lot of different disruptions that we can think of, and certainly I've seen all of them in my experiences. The example I just gave with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was one around technology, but we can think about changes in customer preferences, demographic changes. That's a very large one. Here in Southern California, we're aging quite rapidly, and so we're looking at what does that mean to have an aging population, competitive actions, new competitors, new entry. When I was working with Nestle in Malaysia, that was a very big story. We had Indonesian firms which had amassed huge amounts of capital because of the size of the population in Indonesia, which were expanding internationally, and in essence, coming into market and undercutting prices and providing very new options. And so this was a very huge disruption for that particular firm. There's obviously issues around regulatory changes, and then there's also just broader social issues. And certainly globally, most clearly in the US, issues around the Me Too movement, around the treatment of women in the workplace, the Black Lives Matter movement coming out of the murder of George Floyd here in the United States, but really becoming a global issue, has really brought to bear a lot of attention for how organizations think about the treatment of their workforce, but also their role in society in addressing inequality. All of these things, interestingly enough, and that doesn't even include COVID, a pandemic, and how that's impacting everything that we've done over the last 2.5 years. So these are the types of disruptions that organizations leaders find themselves in. And one of the responses that I've seen with organizations in the face of these issues, particularly for-profit firms, but equally true for service delivery firms, is that ultimately the leadership teams have a question to me, and they say, well, given all this, how can we continue to grow? How can our organizations continue to thrive? And I've done a lot of work with these organizations thinking about how they can revitalize their business strategy and change execution. But I mentioned to you earlier that I did quite a bit of work across Southeast Asia and have a lot of interest in that particular region because of the economic activity that's happened there over the last 10 to 15 years. This culminated in me writing a book with several colleagues that explored this region and really focused in on some of the leadership challenges that individuals were facing. So we went and we spoke to several leaders of different types of organizations, government entities, for-profit, domestic firms, and multinational firms. and really asked questions around what were the types of challenges they were facing. We got many of the predictable ones, competition, government regulation. But what was interesting was how frequently the leaders emphasized this issue around social issues and the impact that was having on their firms. And so I'll just give an example to illustrate this point. Here's a chart which shows the OECD educational attainment outcomes for several countries in Asia. And you'll see that, not surprisingly, some of the countries which we typically associate as having very strong educational systems, Japan, Korea, very high scores. And then similarly, if you look at New Zealand, Australia, very comparable. But then I'll bring your attention to the scores here at the bottom for Indonesia and Thailand, two very influential and very large economies in the ASEAN region. And just the very big difference. Why would I point this out? Well, in the work that I was doing with Nestle Malaysia, Singapore, speaking with the former managing director there, he gave a very interesting observation that we recorded in our book. And he noted how the buildup of the talent pool for the future and the success of any country in the long run depends on the quality and foresight of its educational system. And then he went on to say that in his organization, he was very clear that it was the human capital that he had in the country that was perhaps the scarcest asset that they needed to drive growth in this country. And it wasn't the technology, it wasn't the money, it was actually having the caliber of talent in the workforce that they could hire from. And because that was a risk for them, they were actually investing huge amounts of resources to develop that, not just training their own people, but doing external activities that were designed to create a pool of talent that they could further use later on. Now, of course, this was money they weren't using on, this is a publicly traded firm, and so it wasn't dividends they were paying to their shareholders. It wasn't money they were putting into technologies to help production. It wasn't money they were putting into marketing. So there was a very clear opportunity cost for him to be making this decision. But he also believed that this was quite critical to the success of the organization. And so this was an interesting observation for me as to why this, Nestle Malaysia is the largest food manufacturing company in Malaysia, has huge market shares, been one of the first multinationals to enter into the country. By every stretch of imagination, this was the successful firm. And why were they focusing in on this? And so what I began to appreciate was this question around where the growth comes from. Oftentimes, when I work with these organizations, it's followed by a second question: where will we get the workforce needed to drive the growth? And I think this is where my background as an HR professor really kicked in, and I began to really reframe these questions around how organizations deal with disruptions. And I began to see that it was quite clear, though, no matter what the industry sector, region, domain, ultimately, there was always a talent pipeline story. And this is simply just a metaphor that I use to think about the processes by which organizations, in essence, capture value for people. And in essence, it's not that complicated. If you think about any talent pipeline, at some point, there's an entry point where you identify talent and bring them into your organization. Once they're in the organization, they need to be developed. And then at some point, they have to be utilized in some productive way to deliver a service or a product that is of value to your stakeholders. And when I'm working with organizations, what I find is they usually are dealing with some type of constraint and somewhere in that process. They can't get good talent to come. The people they have are unskilled or do not have the right skills, and we have to redevelop them. Or they have great people, but the people leave. We can talk a lot about the Great Resignation, and I've been writing about that recently. They leave before the organization can derive the value from their skills and talents. And so if you have leaks in this talent pipeline, it ultimately can create negative outcomes. Now, what I've noticed is that this same metaphor is equally appropriate if you were to go and look at the outcomes of a community. And so if you think about a community that's struggling socially or economically, in fact, they also have a talent pipeline issue. That these communities oftentimes struggle to attract talent to move there. The people that are there are oftentimes underdeveloped in terms of their skill sets. We oftentimes think about this as educational attainment, and they don't have the skills necessary to drive capability. And I should point out that this is any multiple levels of skill. So one of the issues we're dealing with here in Southern California is that we would like to see the region is thinking about economic growth and how do we maintain a standard of living that is appropriate, what new industries will drive employment. Artificial intelligence is one that the business community has highlighted, but they've highlighted that one of the greatest threats is that the current pool of talent in Orange County doesn't have the necessary skill sets to help drive an artificial intelligence sector. They simply are not developed in the right way. And then the last part is just many communities, even if they have the talent, either the talent is underutilized, so underemployed, or they leave. And so many people, can be appreciative of communities that are focusing on repatriation activities to try to get talented individuals to come back. So that would allow for them to drive economic and social well-being. And these are leaks. And these leaks come in a wide variety of forms, right? It could be access to healthcare. Sick people, as we know, simply cannot work and be productive. It could be issues around social unrest or discrimination or lack of participation in broader institutions. It can be shifts in demographic trends, ethnic changes, aging. It can be access to education. These are all foundational leaks in pipelines. And what we've found consistently is that they have big implications around not just organizational outcomes, but also community outcomes. And as I've done this work, I've been really intrigued to understand how can we shape and strengthen talent pipelines in community, and maybe more specifically, what is the role that educational institutions have in doing this? And I think this is the question I'll focus on for the rest of the presentation. How is it that business schools can create innovations that create strong, resilient, and inclusive talent pipelines? And for me, for my personal perspective, this is the foundational goal that I have for my career. How can I increase access to a world-class education, particularly a business education, regardless of discipline? And I see the expectation that business schools, regardless of the community they're in, should view this as their challenge, and as a result, think very clearly about the innovations they put in place for this to happen. Now, I've thought a lot about this, and I've tried to really execute this type of approach in many different settings. And one of the key learnings that I've taken from this work is that this is ultimately a story about innovation. And if you look at the very foundational elements, I am an academic, so I go back to the literature. And what I see very clearly is, we know a lot about what are the types of things that drive innovations. And what we see is that more times than not, innovation is driven by the combination of complementary expertise. Simply put, that means we don't necessarily come up with ideas that no one's ever heard of before, but we combine existing forms of expertise in novel ways. And in doing that, that creates innovative solutions to problems. It also tends to generate opportunities for sustainability and scale. And that is particularly true if, in combining this expertise, what you're focusing on is having multiple stakeholders, a diverse pool of stakeholders that represent different bodies of expertise that can be combined, which drive implementation, scalability, and sustainability in whatever initiative. And this model of combination of complementary expertise or knowledge has really been a foundational perspective in terms of how I have approached this question of how do business schools play a role in creating talent pipeline innovations. And what I've noticed is that when it is feasible for the business school to become a platform that brings together corporate, government, not-for-profit, and philanthropic organizations around particular issues, that universities are particularly well positioned to be, if you like, this meeting space, this mixing space that allows these organizations to bring their expertise to bear on particularly challenging issues. And in doing so, out of this comes innovations that drive change. So what I want to do is I'm going to bounce you around the globe a little bit, and I want to give you 3 examples of three, if you like, initiatives or innovations that I've been a part of that try to build on this model. And they look at three very different talent pipeline issues and three very different types of populations. But there's a commonality around this. And I hope that this begins to inform how an association like the African Accounting and Finance Association, you yourself as professionals, academics, but also your universities and your institutions can play a role in really thinking hard about the way in which they can change and shape economic and social outcomes. So why don't we start with my adopted home, Australia. I did become an Australian citizen, so I am a US citizen and an Australian citizen. And so I consider Australia my home away from home. And when I arrived there, I mentioned that I ran a social impact center when I was there. And the goal of that center was to understand how the business school can play a role in addressing intractable social issues. What was very clear to me was one of the most important social and economic issues facing the country was the state and the condition of the indigenous community there, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island community. And just a little bit of data on them in terms of the size of this population relative to the other parts of Australia. I should say it's one of the youngest parts of the country, but it also has a very low life expectancy relative to the rest of the population and very low levels of income and wealth relative to the broader population. Employment rates were not of the same level. And it also was the case that business ownership was not of the level that you would have seen across the majority. And this has huge implications for the country, not just the Aboriginal Torres Strait Island community, that this was something that the country could simply not afford to have this population. The population, it's cultural, iconic population that oftentimes seen as one of the longest continuous existing cultures on the planet. So it really had major social and economic implications for the well-being of Australia, not to mention the well-being of this particular community. Now, in this observation, what is the role of a business school? Now, we're not a health organization. We're not going to be employing a lot of people. But one of the things that we do well is we help individuals develop businesses as a means for wealth, employment, self-determination, stability. And we took it upon ourselves in our business school to say, well, what would it look like if we fundamentally changed the success profile of businesses, indigenous businesses? And at that time, there was a recognition by many that the success of the business community played an important role in providing employment. And what we knew is that indigenous businesses were much more likely to hire indigenous individuals, and that this was a training ground really for leadership in that community. And so there was quite a bit of a discussion around how do we do that. The question we raised was, how can we as a business school play a role in that? Now, one thing we knew we could do well was we can train people, and we can develop individuals to identify opportunities, react and respond to those opportunities, and create businesses. But unfortunately, we had seen that there were very few indigenous individuals that actually were receiving formal training in business. And so we set about to create a program that would help rectify that, with the goal being that if we can train individuals, we'd be able to provide them with skill sets. And this would allow their businesses to flourish, which would generate these positive social and economic outcomes of self-determination, wealth, and employment. Now, this program we call it the MURRA program, M-U-R-R-A. And MURRA is an indigenous word. It means fishnet, with the goal being we would capture indigenous entrepreneurs and then develop them, grow them, and then release them and allow them to flourish in the community. Now, we knew how to do this from an infrastructure perspective in terms of training, but we had several issues. Our business school had not had much connection, if any, with the indigenous community prior to this initiative. When I started, we had very few. When I say very few, 15 indigenous alums in the 50+ history years of the school. And so when I proposed this idea, it was quite radical. Many people thought, well, that's not going to happen. And so we began to appreciate we needed to have partners if we were going to actually make something that was innovative and successful. And we had to think about what are the capabilities we need to pull this off. First and foremost, we needed engagement with community. And so the first thing we did is we actually partnered with several of the various different indigenous organizations that were focusing on business growth across the country. Kenaway was a chamber of commerce that was in our region. Supply Nation, a national organization that focused on supporting indigenous businesses to form supplier relationships with larger or Australian organizations. We simply needed organizations that were close on the ground, well respected in the community, and could lend us a cultural understanding of how to develop a culturally appropriate curriculum to develop culturally appropriate indigenous businesses. This was an important first step. We partnered with the companies, and what we said to the companies was, it is important for you to have a sustainable supply chain. And in Australia at that time, and it continues to be, there's actually incentives for organizations to have indigenous companies in their supply chain. And so we said, well, we can help you identify successful firms that will be part of your supply chain and be reliable. And we need you to come to the table to help fund this initiative, because we had ideas, but we didn't have any money. And they were able to provide financial support for this with the expectation that this would help them identify business partners. We went to the government because we wanted this to be a national initiative. So we went to the federal government and we identified that, this is one of the ways in which we could actually decrease social welfare expenditure and increase tax revenue by having successful firms. And there's an entity within the government called Indigenous Business Australia, and they were willing to make an investment in us to scale this. So it became a national program that we were able to bring individuals from across the country. And we also work with philanthropists. First Australians Capital, a philanthropic organization and very much interested in supporting indigenous communities. And they took a chance with us. They were willing to invest to give us the seed capital necessary. And so this ecosystem, if you like, really allowed us to maximize the cultural connection and competencies of the not-for-profit sector, the business acumen and contractual relationships components of the business community, the scale and reach of the federal government, and we benefited from the innovative and risk-taking propensity of philanthropy. We launched this program over 10 years ago, and it has been a tremendous success. And I'm one of the things that I'm most proud of in my career. So it's been recognized as an award-winning innovation, and this is a great picture with Dr. Michelle Evans, who helped me co-found this initiative. She was actually a doctoral student at the time at my business school. She's going on to have a very successful academic career and now leads this program as an associate professor at the University of Melbourne. And so it's been a fantastic opportunity for her career and also the community. We've worked with hundreds of firms across all of Australia at this point and have been able to actually do research to capture understanding of what are the factors that have driven success in those firms and the types of economic and employment outcomes. That's great. But what's even more important is over the years, as we've developed this, we really have created a sense of connection among these firms. And now that alumni group, the Murrah alumni group, has really become a force in the indigenous business sector. That group took it upon itself after several years to organize what we call now the Indigenous Business Month, which is the month of October in Australia. And every October, there's 20 plus activities across the country, which are designed to highlight indigenous businesses, create forums such as the one you see here, which we conducted in Sydney, around issues facing indigenous businesses, using it as a platform of advocacy with government and other entities to highlight this sector. And it's really become a powerful mobilizing activity, something that simply did not exist prior to us starting this. And so this has been a big success. And it really illustrates how a business school can play a role. So let me give a second example to illustrate this example of how business schools can change and fundamentally create resilient, inclusive talent pipelines. I'll just this quote from one of the participants, and it really reshaping the perspectives of what the aspirations can be for individuals, particularly students, particularly young people in the community. And I think that's just very powerful. So let me change tack. So here we had indigenous populations of Aboriginal Torres Strait Island and Australia focusing on entrepreneurship. Let me jump to another one of my adopted homes, and this is very fond of this picture. This is Wellington. This is what Yinka looks at every day, the beautiful Wellington space. So Wellington is an interesting city in the sense that it is the capital, so we have a very large government presence, but it is also the huge presence of IT in that sector. It has been for many years the growth engine of the region. And within Wellington, New Zealand, the IT sector has grown tremendously over the last 10 years. It is a huge driver of GDP. It is the largest concentration of IT companies in New Zealand. Even though Auckland is the biggest city, Wellington is the IT hub. And it is one of the largest employers. So this is critical. However, one of the biggest threats that the industry has faced is a lack of talent. And this is just a common theme across New Zealand. It's a small country. And how do we get people from around the world to come to this small island in the middle of the Pacific? And this is not just unique to New Zealand. The global shortage of IT workers is huge and represents a major constraint on the growth of that sector. And I mentioned earlier, this is even an issue here for us in the United States. So the talent pipeline issue here was, how do we get more people into this? How do we attract them? How do we develop them? How do we utilize them? And as a leader of the business school and one of the leaders of our university, this was particularly given the importance it was to our geographical region. This was a major question for us. So that's the problem. That's the talent pipeline issue. But let me make it even more complex by giving you one more piece of information. So this is just a breakdown of the population of New Zealand. And what you see is two charts breaking it down by age and gender. And on one hand, you have 1981, and on the other, you have 2013. And in essence, what it's showing is that New Zealand is getting old and is aging rapidly. And so right now, about 15% of the population is over the age of 65, 20% of the population is under the age of 15. And that's going to change quite quickly over the next 10 years, and such that there'll be more people over the age of 65 if the current trend holds than there are under the age of 15. And it has major implications for the economy. Old people consume very different than young people. And not to stereotype, but if you're trying to grow an IT economy, not having young people, the digital natives, represents a major constraint. And certainly what that may mean is the businesses leave and they go to other places and they no longer set up shop, not just in Wellington, but in New Zealand at all. The one other aspect that's perhaps promising is the indigenous population in New Zealand, the Maori population. They represent about 17% of the population, and they are very young, very different characteristics than the European settlers. So 6% of the population is over 65, 33% of the population is under 15. It's the youngest segment of the population in New Zealand. And so you might look and see that this represents a profile of a community that would be ideal to be the basis for which you grow your future workforce. However, less than 2.5% of the IT workforce in New Zealand is Maori, and less than 1% of Maori students are actually studying towards IT qualifications. And so if you look at this, this does not set the country up well. We have a major talent pipeline issue here. It's not inclusive, it's not resilient, it's aging, and the young population is underrepresented. And so this became something that we had to think very hard about. How can we as a business school use our skill sets to address this issue? And one of the initiatives that was set up was the Wellington ICT Graduate School. And this was a partnership, again, multi-sectors to develop innovation. It was a partnership between IT firms in the Wellington region, our university, as well as the polytechs or community colleges in the region. And what we were, and the government kicked in money, the federal government kicked in money to support this. And they had a clause that the money would only be accessible to the university if we did this in partnership with industry and community colleges. And so, again, you have multiple sectors coming to bear to create a scalable, sustainable initiative. This initiative was primarily around taking existing people in the workforce, adults, and retooling them to be successful IT workforce. So we created a set of bespoke programs that were designed to take existing workers, older adults, and retool them in a short period of time. And we had one-year master's degrees that were designed for people who had no prior experience, but were effectively redeveloping and providing ways for them to utilize this skill set. And we had two of these which we supported out of the business school. Others were supported out of engineering and other parts of the university. And this was really a very interesting cross-sector collaboration designed to develop talent. We had a particular emphasis on trying to identify Maori talent and Pacific Island talent in this particular space. And so this was a way in which, again, we were able to fundamentally try to shift the talent pipeline to enhance the economic and social well-being of the community. I'll give you one last example that brings me to where I am today. And I think it's quite oftenly discussed. America has, I think, many tremendous positive things, but one of the big challenges that the country has dealt with pretty much since its start has been income inequality, and particularly because there's a huge correlation between this income inequality and ethnicity and race. And so you can see the net worth here by ethnic groups and the huge disparity between white and Black and Hispanic populations. This obviously plays over in leadership roles and representation in major companies, high-paying jobs. And again, you'll see major disparity in the US workforce between representation and participation in executive level roles in major companies. And so this has major implications. And one of the things that we know in the last 2 years and the social protests have really been focused on is not just sort of civil rights treatment and the violence that you see perpetrated against minority populations, but also economic participation. And this has been something that our business school has been thinking about. How can we play a role in addressing this? Now, foundationally, one of the big barriers here is simply providing access to financial education and literacy so that all communities and all households actually can effectively engage. And we've made our goal to provide financial education to all levels of the community as one of the ways in which we can fundamentally shift this. And we've implemented an initiative through one of our centers of excellence, a Center for Investment and Wealth Management. And actually give credit to the director of that center, Professor Chris Swartz, who's done a fantastic job in developing this. And there's some more information at that center on our website. But the pinnacle of this is a program called LifeVest. LifeVest is a residential program we run for high school students, particularly starting at the early phases of high school, where we provide them with financial literacy skill sets. And we bring them to campus. We use it as a means to help them get exposure to a university. We focus on our region, and we particularly are interested in bringing in students from underrepresented communities. This is a partnership. We are funded by philanthropic sources, companies, and multiple stakeholders. So again, a multiple stakeholder approach towards this initiative, working very closely with the school districts, the public school districts, as well as private schools, to get students to come. We've been running this now for several years, over a decade. We've had hundreds of students go through, and we have some phenomenal outcomes. And what we're seeing is that the students that participate in this, a large percentage, much higher than the national average, go to college. We've been able to focus in on those groups which are most impacted by this income inequality, women and underrepresented minorities, or what we refer to as URM. Particularly in our context, roughly 35% of the population of Orange County would be identified as Hispanic or Latinx. And so we've been able to have a very large representation. And so, this has been a big success for us, and an initiative, again, about changing fundamentally the pipeline. And this is about really looking at the early phases of that pipeline. Now, interesting enough, as we've done this work, we focused on high school students, but we've also been able to do some work looking at college students. And what we found was that, in fact, financial literacy was very low among our own students, even though we are a very selective university. And that this was creating all types of negative implications for our students in terms of stress, impact on academic performance, and other really important things. And so we've done some research on this, and we've now have created a program where we have not just a financial literacy program for high school students, but we actually run one for our students. In fact, this upcoming school year, we have developed a relationship such that any student that receives financial aid from our university, when they come in, will be, as a requirement for them to receive that financial aid, will have to go through a financial literacy course. And this is something that the provost at our university has implemented. And we believe this will have very positive implications on our student body, because what we know is that many of the students that are receiving this financial aid are in fact low-income students, first and family students, students coming from Latinx or Black communities. And so we think this is a very important way to, again, fundamentally reshape that pipeline. So let me wrap up, and then we can take any questions that people have. Just some observations, right? So I think first and foremost, that this notion of a resilient talent pipeline should be front and center in the strategies of educational institutions, particularly business schools. And that, the questions to be asking are, what are the social issues faced by the communities in which our institutions are present? How is this showing up? How is this impacting or creating leaks in our talent pipeline? And how can our institutions work with external partners, whether they be government entities, whether it be not-for-profit firms, companies, philanthropic sources, to develop innovations that can ensure strong talent pipelines. This has been something which I've been very proud to be able to participate in a wide variety of settings. I do hope this information has been useful. Very keen to talk to you some more about what I've done or what we're doing, and would be even more excited to think about ways in which I might partner with you or some of your institutions. So thank you very much, merci, and I'll stop sharing, and hopefully we can have a conversation.
Well, thank you, Prof. That was very helpful. I hope Vidisha was able to get a bit of translation going through for the French listeners. But hopefully, yes, you've touched on so many things, but I want to open the floor first and see whether people have some questions to ask before maybe I chip in anything. So I don't know if there's anybody who wants to ask Prof a direct question. Feel free to raise your hand and just speak straight.
And if people want to place something in the chat.
Oh, okay. I think Professor Matthew has got his hand up. Prof, please go ahead and speak.
Yeah, Prof. So the excellent presentation, and it's also good to see the connection to SIPS. I saw SIPS actually on your the PPT that show where you've worked. So I'm currently based at SIPS in Ghana. SIPS has a campus in Ghana. I'm the director here. So I probably will reach out to you immediately after this session to have a conversation. But the question I want to ask is actually about, it's quite impressive. It's about industry collaboration with academia. I've seen how you've done it, and so you have the experience in it. But what are they, I think in my experience is always, sometimes we feel that the industry doesn't understand the role of academia, and it's very difficult, sometimes like a brick wall. So I really wanted to know from your experience how you've been able to achieve it, because it's very impressive. And I just want to maybe get some thoughts from you in terms of how this should actually be done. What would be the best approach?
Well, I should paint the picture first and foremost in a realistic way. It is difficult. I've shown you examples of successes, but there's a lot of initiatives that or at least attempts to connect with industry that didn't always lead to success. So a little bit of this is just a war of attrition. You just got to keep trying. But one of the things that I've stressed is that, this is particularly true for a business school in my mind, that we must be connected to industry for us to be able to do the types of things that we want to do from a research perspective, as well as developing our students. And what I've learned over time is that oftentimes the barrier that we face is that we will go to industry and we will talk about the work that we're doing, and with an assumption that this is of value. And that is where I think you run into problems. What I've oftentimes started with is, what are the major questions or major issues that are facing the region that I'm in? What are the biggest issues? And if I was to solve that issue, who would benefit? So which companies, which communities, which government agencies would benefit? So if I go back to the issue associated with the Aboriginal Torres Strait Island community in Australia, we frame that as, you know, first and foremost, we knew that this had major economic implications for Australia. And we said, if we figured out a way to increase the success of indigenous businesses, who would be excited by that? And you know, we realized it was different entities for different reasons. So the companies would be excited because they were under pressure to actually diversify their supply chain. So anything that we talked to them about, even though I was a management scholar and I was interested in understanding workforce development and doing research in that space, that was not going to be interesting to BP. But BP was definitely interested in understanding how to diversify their supply chain. And so when we spoke with them, we said, what are some of the barriers you're facing as you try to diversify your supply chain? And they expressed it. They said, well, listen, we have a way that we think of helping you identify firms that are skilled, and we will train them so that they are more reliable as suppliers. And that became interesting for them. Similarly, I said, well, who will be interested in solving this problem? The government. Why would they be interested? Because they were interested in understanding how to move from a social welfare model to a social investment model. And so it really was around, how do we best understand the issue from the lens of the corporate, then bring our capability more as a customized service, as opposed to, I'm a management scholar, I do research on these questions, and if you're interested in these questions, come talk to me. That approach just simply did not work. And it really forced me as a scholar to be a lot more broader about how I frame the questions that I'm interested in answering. And once I began to develop that skill set, it became easier and easier for me to identify ways to partner with different companies, and then ultimately how I can shape opportunities for our business school to partner with different entities. So that's the learning I have from that. It doesn't sound overly complex, but it is quite critical in terms of the initial framing about how you engage with these entities. And I would love to talk to you about the work you're doing in SEEBS and Ghana, so please reach out to me after this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Just before you go to the next question, before anybody will ask another question, I want to launch a poll here, and on the basis of the response from that poll, maybe you will address more specifically the demographics of people on the call in terms of how, you know, what you've just talked about fits into their everyday activity. So I'll launch a poll now and see if we can quickly tick off and see. So there's a poll going through now. If you can just answer that quickly, let's see how it's going. Good. and while that's happening, Professor Williamson, what I would like you to talk about is, we're going to see shortly where we've got the critical mass in terms of the demographics here. And what I would want you to do is to say, how would you, in practical terms, see how you support these people individually when it comes to, you know, building that network beyond the institutional level? How will this now fit in to the individuals? How do I, as a person, for instance, establish network and collaborations? How do I strengthen my leadership skills practically?
Yeah, so I should stress, you know, I'm speaking today from the lens of, from the position of being a dean of a business school, but I haven't always been a dean of a business school. And, you know, this was work that I started long before I actually had those types of leadership roles. And, you know, I'm mindful that for those who are academics and have some type of tenure requirement and promotion requirement and publications and teaching, you know, one of the things that I certainly used as a strategy was I viewed this space as being something that would be important for me over the course of my career. However, you know, I had all the pressures that everyone had about performing as an academic. And so what I said is, well, I want to continue to grow in this particular space and use my skill set, but I have to do it in a way that allows me to be successful with my own career goals. And so, you know, when I was as an academic, how did this play out? Well, you know, there were very interesting research questions that needed to be answered. And to answer those and get them published in journals, the key was I'm an empirical researcher, so I needed data. And one of the questions was, well, I was interested in doing research on entrepreneurship. So one of the challenges if you want to do research on entrepreneurship is actually very difficult to capture data from entrepreneurs. And so if I look at the project that I talked about, the Murrah program, one of the things that was critical to that program was that was also a way for me to collect data on indigenous businesses. And so we collect data for these businesses nationally, hundreds of them over time. And so that was a vehicle for me to actually get publications. In fact, I know the picture of me with Dr. Michelle Evans. She was a doctoral student when we started this. And it was very important for me that she be successful. She was one of the few indigenous doctoral students in the country. And so, we needed her to be successful. I said, Michelle, listen, this is going to be the body of research that's going to get you a job and it will get you tenure. And in fact, she's been working on projects from data, qualitative and quantitative data that she's collected from the Murrah program for the last 10 years, right? So this was a very systematic R&D effort, if you like, where we were saying, we're gonna do work in this area, but as we did this work, we were able to get research grants from the government that were very high profile, which counted towards tenure, which gave her work profile. We were to collect data. The research grants give us resources to hire RAs, which allows us to do the research. It also became mechanisms for us to create cases that we can use in our teaching. And so I think it's just being very strategic about how you align your activities such that you get synergy. And then as you take on leadership roles, perhaps you can get broader ranges of resources that you can use.
Thank you, Prof. I think I've just closed that poll now and I'll share the results. So I don't know if you can see on your screen. So currently, at the moment, we have about 29% as people who head departments and who are looking after other staff members. So that's a very good point. You've just been talking. So I wanted to just get a real
example. One of the things we're working on right now is Orange County, where I am, Southern California, is known for being a hotbed of startup activity. And I have quite a few scholars who are interested in doing research on entrepreneurship and innovation. Many of them are young, early in their career, and they're trying to capture data. And one of the things that I've thought about is how can we as a business school be a platform to accelerate the careers of these scholars? And so what we're doing right now is we're actually going out and we're partnering with business accelerators and incubators and venture capital funds and other types of entities that are designed to support early phase business growth. And we've said to them, can we be an entity that stores the data of your activity, right? So capture all the information about what you're doing. And in doing so, this would help inform your investment decisions. This would help inform the way in which you provide services to support businesses. So we'll make ourselves available to provide you with that insight, but we'll have the data which allows my scholars, particularly my junior scholars, to be able to do research that is unique, that will enhance their careers, that will allow them to be promoted and be successful. And so I noticed you have a lot of head of departments. And one of the questions that you have in an administrative role for a university is, how do you make the parts more valuable collectively than individually? And this is where, how can our business school become a platform that actually provides resources or access or skill sets that individual business professors can't get on their own? Because just quite quickly, all of us can be individual entrepreneurs doing our own little project. What is the value of doing that at an institution? Why would my business school be a better place for you to do that research project than someplace else? And it's because we can give you access to certain things like data or connections or industry. And if, as a department head, part of that is managing the internal operations of that area. But it also is thinking, how do we leverage the collective capabilities? So one scholar can't have a relationship with 5 different VC funds, but 10 scholars can, if I can pool their expertise to answer a wide variety of questions.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Prof. One question that came in through the chat is social welfare model, so social investment model. It is very interesting perspective. Can you expand on this? I think somebody Henry in particular wanted you to talk more about this.
Yeah, so I actually would point to New Zealand as a country which has really done quite a bit of work. And in fact, several of the scholars, several of Yinka's colleagues at the Wellington School of Business and Government are really world leaders in the research in this particular space. And it really is, you know, taking a perspective of saying, how can government, in this case, make investments, social investments in particular initiatives that will generate major return on investment for society? So how can $1 in a particular training initiative generate outcomes on the back end in terms of success, whether that be in terms of educational outcomes, well-being? There was a lot of work that was looking at incarceration and understanding how investments in certain particular programs that might prevent recidivism would prevent high levels of, incarceration, particularly in Maori communities and Pacific communities. But the same can be true in terms of how can we make investments. So for us, if I think a social investment model, what we've said is we believe an investment of a certain amount of money into financial literacy education early on in the careers of the lives of individuals, high school students, has major implications for overall productivity of those individuals over their first phase of their career. And we're seeing that those students are much more likely to go to college, they're getting better jobs, they're making better financial decisions, they're not falling into debt. They're being more productive. And so for a very relatively low cost investment around financial literacy early on, both for our college students and our high school students, we can actually enhance their productivity, the benefits of their education to the well-being of their family. And so this is the type of logic, creating theoretical models of social change, right? That then drive investment models for how we engage with particular issues.
Thank you. There's another text, I think, let me see, very interesting. This is from Professor Gaza Ismail, very interesting presentation with great illustrations of win-win collaborations between companies, scholars, and regions. Does the business school, I suppose, have a role to play where those interests are not aligned? And beyond helping business achieve their objectives, can we also help them to develop different objectives, for example, more socially oriented or sustainable ones?
I definitely think there's a role here. We are not neutral participants. So I think it's very critical. All of our institutions play a role in socializing individuals and in shaping what they value and how they act on their values. I think it is dangerous for us to think that business education is not value laden in some way, shape, or form. And I stressed earlier, when we were working with the indigenous communities in Australia, one of the first things we had to really think about was, how do we develop a culturally appropriate business? Culturally appropriate meaning embedded with the values from that community and shaping and using that to shape our educational experiences. But I'll give you an example of this. So another project I work on, different than the MURA program, was actually working with what does it look like to have a sustainable mining sector? Now, mining resource industry is a very controversial sector, quite influential. Many of the countries represented here today would have a very large resource mining sector of some sort. And it is complex. It drives economic outcomes. It provides employment, but it also has implications about environmental sustainability. And in many cases, the mining operations are also criticized for exacerbating social issues. So we were struck, obviously in Australia, this is a big part of the economy there. And we were actually approached by Oxfam, a not-for-profit organization that had a pretty strong, almost militant approach towards how they were engaging with the resource sector. Many would have seen them as anti-mining. And they actually came to us and said, we're actually not anti-mining. We want this to be done in a sustainable way. We appreciate the economic benefits it has for communities, but we want it to be done in a way that does not jeopardize or reduce social outcomes. And they actually wanted to work with the mining companies on this, but they found that the mining companies weren't interested in working with them for obvious reasons. They've been protesting these companies. And so they said, you're a business school. You can talk to companies. Can we work with you to develop a forum where we can sit down with mining companies? So here I have a not-for-profit organization approaching me, a business school, to work with mining companies. And so we launched this thing called the Sustainable Mining Forum. I was quite nervous the first time because I thought this might turn into a very contentious issue. Invitation only, we brought together mining companies, NGOs, investors, government agencies to the business school to have a discussion about sustainable mining issues. This was a tremendous success. We ran this initiative for 8 years, and it became highly sought after, and it became a forum for these sectors to think about solutions to the role of gender in mining, environmental issues, economic participation, and how they could collaborate around these issues to create sustainable mining opportunities, not just in Australia, but wherever they had mines. And so here, I think, was a great example of how we as a business school could be a platform that actually was shaping the objectives of major economic players. And I was really pleased at that. And even though I didn't know if it was going to work at the initial phase, but it really showed the convening power of a business school and how we are not values neutral, that we can actually shape the decision-making capabilities and the orientations of leaders of very powerful organizations.
Thank you, Prof. I think you have touched on the key things. I don't know if there's any question from, great, okay, that's guys are giving a point, great example. I don't know if there's any question coming through. Anybody wanted to say something? Okay, good. Just one thing I want you to touch on, and I can see just listening to how you've moved across schools, continents. One thing I was thinking about is that agility, that ability to transfer, learned experience in different places and, make them adaptable in new setting, whether it's in Australia, in New Zealand, or in the United States as you currently operate from. Africa is a different kettle of fish. You probably will know a bit. But in saying that, African countries and African scholars are faced with tremendous and sometimes, very difficult, obstacles. Sometimes they don't get the kind of support and resourcing you can easily get, looking after a business school, the one you look after. And what I would want you to speak to, and is just from your general experience or what you can advise is how they can, begin to, make do with, like I keep saying, it's not important to complain about what already doesn't exist. The resourcing would always be limitation. The opportunities will be limited, but how do they make the best use of what they currently have? And that could also mean what other opportunities of collaborations and synergy are there for leaders currently managing schools or centers that do not have that very many opportunities to still build on capacity and go on to do the great things you have done and other schools are doing.
Well, I started off by saying, there's a conceptual model that I've been working with. So I'm an academic, and as a result, the work I do starts with theory. If I've been able to do something, it's because I've been able to take that theory and apply it in settings. But the beauty of great theory, and this is certainly what I teach my students, the beauty of great theory is it generalizes, right? And so the actual actors, the actual actions are dissimilar, but the foundational premises stays the same. And so, the same thing I was doing to work with indigenous communities in Australia was exactly the same thing I was doing to work with mining companies, right? A cross-sector collaboration based on combination of complementary expertise. Obviously, the mining companies had way more money, right? But the foundation was there. And I should note that, I've done this work or tried to do this work in communities which were simply just not very did not have a lot of resources. So we work with some communities in Thailand, Ubud Rajasthani University in Mukdahan over near the Mekong River, very, very low economic activity, and how in that there was a growing, a new university that was being founded there. And we were working with the president around how do you take this model and embed it into this community, which really did not have a lot of economic opportunity. And really, they were trying to identify what that was going to be. And we did this work similarly. And I mentioned I had spent some time living in Indonesia working with the university there. So I think it's feasible And it goes back to that foundational questions that I provided earlier. What are the key social issues? How are they impacting key aspects of the talent pipeline? If you solve them, who would care? And there's an economic model that is existing in all communities. It may have bigger or lower numbers of zeros, right? But there is economic activity, and I'm beginning to identify where are the leaks in that pipeline that are causing constraints. How can education play a role in that? And then the innovation becomes education on what, education by who, education in what model, right? And then beginning to understand where your institution, wherever it may be, I've been in institutions with a lot of resources. I've been in institutions with a little resource. There's still the educational delivery mechanism that we have. That's our contribution. How do we make that accessible on the right topic? And, if it was the context around indigenous businesses, it was around building businesses. If it was in New Zealand, it was around IT skill set. If it was in US, it was around financial literacy. Like, what we teach is determined by the problem, but we can teach, right? We have scholars, we have scholarship. And so it's about how do I then develop that capability in myself or in my colleagues and make it accessible. So I would certainly acknowledge, each organization represented today has its constraints. I would say University of California, Irvine as an organization has a lot of resources, but we don't have the resources of Harvard, right? So everybody's got a bigger brother, right? And so you just kind of understand. And so that means there's certain problems I can't solve, right? But that doesn't mean there's no problem I can't solve. And maybe I can use my examples as pilots to garner bigger resources. So when I first started that Murrah program, we started that program with a donation of $30,000 from a small group of philanthropists who were willing to take a bet on us, and we had 11 people. We had no idea if that was going to work, right? Fast forward, it's now grown to something that's got its own staff and it's got its own thing, but we really started it with, in the Australian context, it's a very expensive place to operate. $30,000 doesn't go very far. And so I just got, but why I knew we had potential there was the problem was a big problem. So if you focus on major problems, even if the first bite is a small one, again, I knew if I solved this problem, there were a lot of people that were going to be interested. So getting capital on the back end wasn't going to be a problem. I just need to have a good innovation.
Well, that's good. Oh, thank you, Prof. I think we have been talking deeply into all these things, and just so that I'm not taking all the show, any question? Well, not any that I can see. I think you've really addressed the key things, and I don't know if there's one more point you want to leave with us as an advice or steps going forward.
Well, I would simply say one, Messi, thank you very much for the time. I do hope that what I've shared is useful. I would encourage individuals, each of these different initiatives that I've talked about, I've done at different phases in my career. And what was nice is when I was able to use my academic teaching and research in a way that actually also met with a broader goal for me personally to have a broader social impact in the work that I was doing. And so I would encourage people to be creative about that. It's not just at the dean's level, department chair level, or, it can happen in any phase of your career. But, our contribution to society is through our scholarship. As a collection of academics, we can make a difference in that, but it's about how we're innovative and applying it. And we can do that. I've not seen it be a trade-off between me publishing or being a great teacher, but it did require me to be strategic about the synergy that I was able to create across that, and take some risks. And certainly when I started all these programs, the ones that I started at the first phase, they were like, this isn't going to work. And so I think just being open with that. And finally, I would say I was really excited to accept this invitation because I personally am very keen to understand how I, as a professional, individually, can play a role in supporting some of the things that are going across the various countries represented here. I just see, I believe the fate of the world in the next phase of our economic activity will be shaped by what happens across the continent of Africa. And I certainly saw that in Southeast Asia, where that region has generated tremendous GDP that has actually enhanced the lives of a lot of people around the world. I would love to be able to support that activity across the countries represented here today, either through my own activity or through the work that we do as a school. So if I can be of support in that, please feel free to reach out to me. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Professor Ian Williamson. Surely we'll be touching base with you. And it's also mentioned that it was through your introduction that I was able to get in touch with the PhD project, which we have been doing quite a few things together. And Professor Theresa Hammond is on the call. I think if she's still there, she's also part of, the supporting block. And I'm very proud of what the likes of people like you and Theresa are doing through that initiative. Now, Theresa, if you're still on the call, you want to say something about that now that Ian is still here?
Yeah, it's really great. I really enjoyed your presentation so much, but I can't believe we've never met in person, but I was involved in the founding of the PhD project because I had done, I was on the Minority Faculty Development Committee with Bernie Milano at the American Accounting Association. And I had done a research paper on African-American doctoral students in accounting. And so it was one of the things I was going to say is you twigged me to that as one of the things you can do as a leader is try to make sure that when you do research that you share it with a lot of people so that if someone finds it useful, they might end up using it as a tool to develop other programs. So the PhD program the PhD project is one of the things I'm most proud to be associated with.
So I should say I would not be here today if it wasn't for the PhD project. That was the vehicle that actually, and in fact, much of what I've been able to do, I've modeled after that initiative, which I think is one of the most successful, innovative talent pipeline disruptions that we've seen in this country. And for people who don't know, this is a program here in America that is designed to expose and encourage Black, African-American, Hispanic, Native American individuals to pursue PhDs in business, and has really quadrupled the number of Black, Hispanic, and Native American PhD business professors in the last 25 years that has been in existence. I benefited from being in one of the very first cohorts, and nothing in my career has happened without that particular project. And I use that as a template and shaping. It is a very clear collaboration between the academy, companies, not-for-profit organizations, philanthropic entities. And so and I think that story around how do we ensure we have the pool of talent coming, inclusive, resilient talent pipelines is very, very critical in the academy. We simply don't have a representation of all the communities that need to be taught in front of the classroom. If we don't get that right, we're not going to be successful.
Well, thank you to two of you. And I think that's basically one of the key goals for us here in the African Accounting and Finance Association is actually tapping into that pipeline and developing talent in Africa. For those of us who had our first education in Africa, now overseas, one of the key things we're trying to do is to constantly find ways to kind of give back into that same system that give us the very first foundational knowledge we have and continue to build. So I want to thank both of you. And Theresa is no visitor to what we do, and we'll continue to tap into both of your expertise and skill. I'm very pleased that you're always very willing to take my invitation and happy to come around to help us every time we need to. I think that's about. I think we do have a few minutes left, but I think, Ian, I'll let you off the hook. But certainly, feel free to, jump around if you have time. I know it's still, what time is it now? It's still morning. You're about to start your day.
Yeah, it's about 5:45 a.m. So a little bit earlier start to my day than normal.
So, but if you find time throughout the workshop, we'll be happy to hear from you when we get into those breakout room. Theresa herself has a session later, and I think it's all good to go. We're very pleased to have all of you, and I know everybody would have enjoyed what you have to share with us this morning from your end. So thank you, and this is where we bring this session to a close. Philip, if you are in the room, please maybe just you want to help me tell our Francophone
Okay.
family, just a wrap up of how we've gone and what we'll be doing next.
Ok, Yinka. Alors, et cette session du matin vient à terme, donc on va prendre congé, une pause jusqu'à la prochaine session, je crois, c'est à 13h30, donc on va prendre une pause et puis on se retrouve à 13h30.